stepping in. Sorry, I cannot hear you. I don't know if it's just me.
No, that's because I'm not saying anything.
Sorry.
Good. Okay, so are we all good to kick off?
Let's give it one more minute. I'm trying to reach one more MP from Mexico to see if she's able to.
Thanks for bearing with us, everyone.
Good morning. This is Shandana.
Hello.
Chair Commonwealth Women Parliamentarians. My pleasure to be here. And I believe I'm talking to Mr. Byrne. How are you?
I'm very well. How are you doing? Thanks so much for joining us.
You're very welcome. Well, thank you.
People that get going. Liam, I think we can start. I will the MP from Mexico connect in the meantime.
Perfect. Right. Well, good morning or good afternoon, everybody. My name's Liam Byrne. I'm the chair of the Parliamentary Network on the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. But for the purposes of this meeting today, I am Cornelius, who we've not been able to connect to. So I've stepped in at the last minute. And so forgive me for my slightly ragged chairing, but we are also delivering our financial statement to the House of Commons today. So I've had to step out of that and come and join you. Thank you so much to everybody for joining us. As you know, these Parliamentary Dialogue Series have got two important purposes. Number one, we need to try and make sure that our colleagues in the World Bank and the IMF hear directly from you about your experiences of things that are going wrong, or things where there are good things happening, where there's good positive experience to share. But these dialogue series also help us just refine programs that are run by the Bretton Woods institutions to help parliamentarians in the work that they do. The second purpose is for us all to deepen our understanding of what programs the IFIs are offering, so that in our work as parliamentarians, we are better able to draw on that great expertise and, of course, much of the financial resources. So my game plan for this meeting today is to say as little as possible, but to try and make sure that the time that we have together is as productive and as efficient for everybody. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Hannah Brixey, who's the Global Director for Gender for the World Bank, who's going to help us underline why this meeting is just so important. Because in a world where inequality is spiraling, we all know that we do need to redouble our effort to deliver that most basic equality of all, which is gender equality. Hannah, let me hand the floor to you, and thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and thank you for this excellent introduction. So, honorable members of Parliament, gender equality and empowerment of women and girls, as you all know, is central to reducing poverty and enhancing shared prosperity. And at these times, gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls are also central to the economic recovery from the pandemic crisis and to future sustainable economic growth. We see that the COVID-19 pandemic crisis affected women disproportionately through disproportionate job losses, increased care burden, and also constraints in access to social protection, to financing, and to digital services. And for economic recovery from the pandemic crisis, and also to make the recovery sustainable for the future, gender equality is critical in several dimensions. So first, based on evidence, female labor force participation, it boosts total employment, and it can contribute also to economic diversification and to productivity growth. Second, women's and girls' human capital accumulation, including, of course, education attainment and skills, and especially skills relevant for the future economic opportunities, for the future jobs, including or perhaps especially jobs in the green economy. And evidence shows clearly that this contributes, the human capital of women and girls contributes to productivity. Important for this, however, is also empowerment through adolescent sexual and reproductive health and eliminating discriminatory laws and practices. Only this can enable women to unleash their human capital and to fully participate in the economy and to also reduce the transmission of poverty across generations. Third, it's equal access to productive assets and information. Based on evidence, this enhances productivity of women across sectors, including female farmers, entrepreneurs, and women-owned businesses. In many contexts also, women hold greater responsibility than men for stewardship in natural and household resources. And this means that their inclusion in decision-making about the sustainable use of these resources yields a significant positive impact. And fourth, voice and agency, including women's participation in decision-making in households, in communities, in business, in government, and in other spheres. Evidence shows that women's participation in decision-making and leadership contributes to long-term efficiency gains and more effective resource use. Now, let me turn to the Women, Business and the Law 2022 publication, the report that has been just launched by the World Bank Group. It measures the laws and regulations that affect women's economic opportunities across 190 economies. And it looks at 8 indicators around mobility, workplace, pay, marriage, parenthood, entrepreneurship, assets, and pension. And the good news is that between October 2020 and October 2021, 23 economies implemented reforms, improving 39 laws to achieve greater equality of opportunity. 12 economies, compared to 10 in 2020, have scored 100, meaning that women are on an equal standing with men across all areas measured. But despite this progress, women still have only on average 3/4 of the legal rights afforded to men. And this means that 2.4 billion women of working age are not afforded equal economic opportunities. For example, in 86 economies, women face some form of legal job restriction, shutting them out of many high-paying jobs, such as in transport, manufacturing, construction, water, energy, or mining. In 56 economies, the law treats men and women differently when it comes to freedom of movement. 46 economies do not have legislation on sexual harassment in employment. And in 55 out of 95 economies where the public sector provides childcare services for children below formal pre-primary school starting age, only 20% mandate free provision. Now, the Women, Business and Law analysis in 2022 explores also the implementation gap by introducing a new conceptual framework for its measurement. And it finds that even in areas with strong foundational legislation, implementation and enforcement of laws may be weak. Parliamentarians, of course, play a key role in the legal reform process, and the Parliamentary Network here is an important partner for the World Bank Group in supporting reforms that improve women's lives and gender equality overall. So let me give you a few examples what the World Bank Group is doing in promoting gender equality. So overall, as you may know, the World Bank Group is advancing data, knowledge, and financing to support institutional and policy reforms, and also investments toward gender equality in countries. So parliamentarians and other decision makers and stakeholders can benefit, for example, from the newly launched gender data portal, which allows access to relevant sex disaggregated data and gender statistics across countries and within countries. It provides the women, business, and law evidence base that you can easily access. Decision makers and stakeholders can benefit from the global knowledge, such as the recently launched research on the gender dimensions of forced displacement, or evidence on what works based on impact evaluations of interventions to advance gender equality. You can also benefit from innovative initiatives such as the Empowering Women by Balancing the Law initiative toward reforming discriminatory legislation. And in terms of project financing, for example, the development policy operations increasingly support policy reforms toward gender equality as part of overall country policy reform packages. And we will hear from speakers, honorable speakers from Pakistan, where, for example, a series of World Bank development policy operations has been supporting labor law reforms in factories and shops to increase female labor force participation. And finally, through our year-long Accelerate Equality initiative, we are exploring the progress made and lessons learned over the past 10 years in closing gender gap and in promoting girls' and women's empowerment. And we explore opportunities and partnerships for transformative change in the future. And we will soon be drafting, in collaboration and consultation with stakeholders around the world, the new World Bank Group Gender Action Plan. So let me conclude, honorable members of Parliament, that transformative change toward gender equality requires a concerted effort by all branches of government, by the private sector, and by civil society. This will require further reforms in law and policies, further investments, further interventions to shift social and gender norms, and I would say further audacity to change power relations between men and women. Thank you.
Hannah, thanks so much. And thank you for the note of audacity that you finished on there. The story that you set out in the brilliant analysis published by the World Bank in many ways is depressing reading. Because it just underlines how far we have still got to go. But we might as well face the truth and do something about it. So thank you for such a brilliant way to give us a flying start to this conversation. This conversation is especially important because of the perfect storm of factors now coming together. In much of the world, COVID is not over. And while in many rich countries, we're talking about a fourth booster, many people around the world are still troubled by trying to get hold of their first jab. Second, we now obviously have very, very sharply rising food prices for both wheat and maize. Wheat prices up by well over 80%, maize prices up sharply, energy prices up sharply. But the flexibility, the freedom that states have to act to help to support this, to support families, is obviously now much diminished. Many are now out of fiscal capacity, and with interest rates rising, many are now facing real problems with debt sustainability. So we have to make sure that we have a response that actually advances gender equality despite these new challenges that are being thrown at us. And that's why this conversation and your work is so important. Now, we're going to hear from Ratan now from the International Monetary Fund. Ratan, thank you so much for joining us. And you're going to brief us on this incredibly important piece of work about mainstreaming gender at the International Monetary Fund, and in particular, the recent work that you've published on tackling legal impediments to women's economic empowerment. Thank you so much for joining us. The links to the documents are going to be in the chat. Please look at them and please share them on your social media channels and in the work that you do as communicators. Just a quick reminder, the interpretation button is at the bottom right of your screen. And again, if you have questions that you want to begin flowing through for the conversation at the back end of this meeting, please feel free to post some of those questions in the chat and I'll do my very best to bring you in. But Ratna, let me hand over to you.
Thank you very much. Honorable members of Parliament, it's a pleasure to be here with you today, and I look forward to an engaging discussion on supportive policies and legal frameworks to increase women's economic empowerment. The need to address gender gaps and reduce inequality has never been more urgent, and as Hannah noted very eloquently, the COVID-19 pandemic has worsened pre-existing gaps, proportionately affecting women. So over the last 8 years, IMF staff have examined a wide array of factors that drive gender disparities, including education, health, financial access, legal barriers, and cultural norms. With our research clearly showing the links between gender inequality, macroeconomic growth, and stability, which is our mandate, the IMF's executive board and management have recognized the need for designing a fresh approach to how the IMF can more effectively support our member countries on gender issues. I have been recently appointed as Senior Advisor on Gender in the Office of the Managing Director. This is quite unusual, but it is to signal the importance of this topic. And I have been tasked developing the IMF's first ever strategy on mainstreaming gender work at the IMF. Of course, compared to international institutions, we are a late starter. The vision of our proposed strategy is very ambitious. We are aiming to apply a gender lens to all of the IMF's core activities. And these are mainly three: surveillance, lending, and capacity development. But given our ambitious strategy and limited resources, as well as expertise, it's going to take time for us to implement. But we are committed to making steady progress. So the proposed strategy starts from the premise that reducing gender disparities and promoting macroeconomic and financial stability is a two-way street. In one direction, well-designed fiscal, monetary, and financial policies can support better and more inclusive economic outcomes for the benefit of women and girls. In the other direction, improving women's access to opportunities and roles goes hand in hand with higher economic growth, greater economic and financial stability and resilience, lower inequality. So this strategy also to implement a consistent and systematic approach for country engagement using innovative and tailored analytical tools to develop customized and granular policy advice for our member countries. Finally, the strategy recognizes the importance of collaborating other IFIs especially the World Bank, who already had a head start, but also other international organizations, academics, CSOs. This proposed strategy is going to be discussed in mid-June by the IMF board, following which we will begin to implement the strategy. The topic of today's discussion, legal frameworks and gender inequalities. I will briefly highlight the main findings from new research from the IMF's legal department and how the new gender plans to address this issue. This research shows that a range of legal barriers in countries' domestic laws have prevented women from achieving full economic empowerment. And in many of these countries, their legal frameworks may not only reflect, but also perpetuate cultural norms that impede women's economic participation. It is also well established that gender-responsive legal and institutional reforms can support greater participation of women in the economy, increase economic and financial benefits for women, and at the same time, deliver positive macroeconomic outcomes for the country. For these reasons, legal reforms can accomplish several tasks. First, they can eliminate existing legal barriers. Second, they can incentivize women to pursue opportunities to fully participate in their economy. Third, change mindsets regarding women's societies. And finally, they can hold institutions and individuals accountable for achieving the desired results. And as the World Bank's report that Hannah just talked about highlights, there are still many countries that have gender discriminatory laws. In this context, a new working paper from our staff, which is led by Catherine Christopherson, and she's with us today, she will be Q&A, describes the key types of legal barriers to women's economic empowerment, and through a selection of case studies, illustrates how these barriers can be overcome. There are lessons to be learned, best practices for other countries from these case studies. Consistent with our proposed strategy, this paper also makes the case for IMF's role in its core functions, surveillance, lending, and capacity development, to narrow gender gaps through legal reforms. Let me end by appealing to you to support our proposed strategy to closing gender gaps through your representatives on the IMF's board. Thank you.
Well, that's extremely welcome to see the fund taking the steps that it's taking. I mean, many of us on this call would salute strong female leadership at the fund that we've seen over the last few years. And it is brilliant to see how that is being translated now into really robust policy frameworks that can help us make a difference on the ground in the countries that we serve. So we've got two more speakers to set the stage. And it's my great pleasure now to head over to Pakistan. It's a particular pleasure as the Member of Parliament here in the UK, who is blessed with the largest number of Pakistani diaspora constituents in our entire country. So it's a particular pleasure for me to welcome Shandana, who's going to speak first on behalf of CPA Women's Network. And I'm so pleased that you're here, because one of the things we want to do with the Parliamentary Network is really strengthen our collaborative work with other parliamentary groups and networks. We think that's a real multiplier for some of the work that we do with Bretton Woods institutions. So I'm really grateful to you for joining us and for working with us. And let me hand you the stage.
Thank you so much, Honourable Liam Byrne. It's also my pleasure here to represent both the National Assembly of Pakistan as well as the Commonwealth Women Parliamentarians. When I won the election of Commonwealth Women Parliamentarians back in 2019, this is just prior to COVID hitting us rather badly, I made a funny pledge, should I be elected, this is what I intend to do. And this is what makes me wonder whether you call it God or Mother Nature has a sense of humor. We decided we were going to launch work on women's financial inclusivity because the work we'd seen that far on SDG 5 in particular, Sustainable Development Goal 5, women and girls empowerment, the problem was pretty evident, but there was no empirical evidence or data at the time to back it up, at least in Pakistan. One of the reasons we were one of the large number of countries that didn't do too well on the Millennium Development Goals of the UN, quite apart from not being able to monitor effectively, and therefore you can't collate the data nor present it. The problem is also that we never thought outside the box. Simplistic as it may seem, we often equate women's development or women's financial inclusivity with women's human rights. And I think that mold has to break at some point in time. Of course, I take off my hat for all the suffragettes, for all the women because of whom it is possible that I'm here today and speaking. But interestingly, in my personal capacity, the reason I am a parliamentarian today, or I have an education, I come from a village, a fairly conservative part of Pakistan in the north, is as a man, my father. It wasn't my mother who had either the capacity or the power sharing in that household to ensure that I get the kind of education every woman deserves. My father was that, how do you say, a balancing factor or the catalyzing factor for getting me here. Now, in Pakistan, we're one of the most overly legislated countries in the world. We don't have a gender wage gap. What we do have is a cultural gap, both in understanding and implementation. And so I'll give you an example. In Pakistan, 70% of our agriculture produce is brought about by the hard work of women and their children. 70% of that is done by women. Whether you look at cattle, livestock, or actual farms, cotton picking, it's also the biological factor. Women have smaller hands than men and therefore are better able to pick the cotton. Unfortunately, not a single province in all of Pakistan, including the Federation, which doesn't have the mandate, but we're trying to introduce it now. Small example, how women have been excluded. 70% of Pakistan's women that live in the rural areas, and out of whom 80% work in the fields. We don't have a single law that actually defines a laborer that would include an agriculture worker. The ostensible reason which was put forward at the time was that we don't wish to limit the amount of wage that can be given to an agriculture laborer, be it female or male. Let them get paid more than the minimum wage. But it has a perverse counterintuitive result that you could pay them as little as 5,000 rupees, which is round about 15 pounds, 20 pounds, and get away with it. So we undertook, I found that my first problem as legislator was that even though the executive is formed by my government, the executive doesn't talk to each other, neither in the Federation nor in the provinces. We're a big country, 220 million people. So the first problem is communication between legislators. The second is the set of laws that we're talking about. We don't have a diagnostic, and this is where I'm going to ask the fund to support us. We have the IMF in Pakistan, a very good institution. A lady is leading the organization, a second one at this point in time. We need an analysis. The ITC, Intrasend based in Geneva, carried out such an analysis for Pakistan for business restrictive laws, and this was done nearly 5 years ago. And the ITC came up with a list of about 40 laws that made it difficult in Pakistan for anybody to operate, regardless of gender. But I think it's high time we did that. We don't have gender sensitive budgets. We don't have gender sensitive FTAs. So those are some of the things that are not even looked at because finance ministry is the one with all the tools, whether it is a finance ministry in the province or in the center. What I'm trying to do in the center through the legislature, we work with across the board. We have something called the SDGs task force. So we're 50 members of parliament. We work with different parties, different genders, different religions. we're probably the only apolitical thing that exists in the National Assembly. And surprisingly, on a lighter note, this is also the only committee and task force that never gets paid. So basically, the only people who come to work are those who actually want change. And so we're working with the former finance minister of Punjab province. We're working with former provincial ministers who are now in the National Assembly. And we've launched a one-year agenda to look at how the financial inclusivity bit is going to be streamlined. We have an incredible program called the SARS program, in which 50% of all financial liquidity, whether it's for school-going children, for hospital, maternal health, or for jobs, or for small or micro loans, all of those are intended for women, and they do not get given out. We ring fence those loans so that money stays with the women. We have a number of programs called Kamyab Jawan, which literally means successful young woman and young man, successful agriculturist. For the first time, we've brought in financial help at very low interest rates. There's a perversion in my country, I'm sure it's in other countries too, and we're talking to our central bank about it, that a rich financier, a rich business person can get a business loan between 3 to 5% interest rates. And somebody, I can't say like me, because I do have some privilege and influence, but a regular Joe or Jane, for that matter, cannot get a loan for less than 40% interest rate because they're seen as high risk individuals. And that is the perversion of the law. And for that, we're talking to the State Bank of Pakistan that if private banks are risk averse, then why have we made it so easy for private banks to operate in contravention of the law? So we are not just looking at legislation, we're looking at how businesses operate. If businesses don't want to work with women, we can't force them. I think I'm coming to the end of my 5 minutes. I'm happy to answer any questions that may be. But I think as a legislator, what I've been doing the last 3.5 years is a huge overview. It's been a long literature survey. And I found out that the only problem is not better legislation, is to figure out which legislation, which regulation, which authority, which province, and what degree of autonomy are we talking about when it comes to bringing in financial inclusivity for women, quite apart from taxation reforms, quite apart from incentives. Thank you so much.
Oh, Chantal, that's brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much for that. Both far-sighted work there, but also quite difficult stuff. Right, let me just bring in Marvi now. You're going to just round out our opening remarks. Then our stage will be set for Q&A. Then we're going to go over to some to and fro. If you've got questions, please put them in the Q&A. One of the advantages of putting it in the Q&A is that if we don't get to your question, we can then give you a written answer. We will try and get through everything, but if we fail in that, we can then come back to you in writing. Marvi, over to you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, the Right Honourable Leon Byrne, and also to Hannah, thank you. It was great going through both the reports. I have specifically 13 recommendations, and I'd like to go through them. First and foremost, social safety nets, especially since I was the minister for the Benazir Income Support Program, which is now renamed SARS, but which was launched much before our government's time, which was launched in 2008. I think they're absolutely critical for economic inclusion, and not just because of the cash handouts or the education programs or the graduation programs, but because they hold an entire database, which is the household survey, which can then do multiple things, which then governments can use for various other purposes, and which governments are continuing to do. And I'm happy to see that they're doing that. So that was my first point. Second, as far as empowering women is concerned, I think what's important is making national and global GDP sense. Because really the cost of exclusion has not been projected in cabinet. And as a former cabinet member, I can say that when you've come up within your reports with numbers and statistics, but this information needs to go down to all levels, parliamentary levels, and especially the executive branch, especially the cabinet, so that the cost of exclusion becomes a GDP issue and things are raised within cabinet. So it's not just a question of how many women ministers are there, it's a question of whether the concept is getting across to the leadership and to the others at cabinet level. My third point is that you yourself have said there have been 280 legal reforms that have been made between 1960 and 2010. The question arises, have they been successfully transferred into similar parliamentary countries to multiply, to have a force multiplier effect? I think there is an opportunity that I see there, and that is something that I would like to discuss with Liam later on as well, after this meeting, later perhaps at an opportune time, how we can do that, because there is a grand strategy that I have in place, which I'd like to discuss. Hannah is obviously aware of that, but I think the network, the parliamentary network, is the right place for that. The WBL has done an excellent job, number 4, of identifying gaps in economies on specific laws. Now, it is for us to create legislation for them in all under-gendered economies, but through a grand strategy. Now, for me, the key leverage, what I call effet majeur, the major effects, which are the key leverage points, are financial and economic inclusion. It's climate change livelihoods, gender-based violence, and childcare, and also democratic participation. I think if we get these 5 sorted, 80% of it would have been sorted as a result. The 5th point I have is that you have identified, Ratna, certain key impediments that within your IMF report. As far as constitutional law and civil rights are concerned, barriers need to be translated into GDP cost of exclusion for political leadership to eliminate discriminatory patriarchal attitudes. On your family law issue, I feel there needs to be a balance between religious understanding and conventional minimal international human rights, which must be logically reached. And I say that because I've been through the process of trying to get early marriage bills sorted in my country, and I was threatened with blasphemy. So I have been through that process. I speak out of experience. Property law, I think, is important, and it was mentioned earlier by Shandana as well. Labor laws, in fact, but property laws, it's an evolutionary process, as the Western rights have demonstrated. So active advocacy of economic benefits is, again, key on that. Coming to labor laws, social safety nets and household registries can eliminate most of the informal economy issues if concerted efforts are made. And on tax law, gender-sensitive laws exist, which need to be projected and lobbied by all stakeholders. And when I say all stakeholders, what I mean is IFIs, governments, INGOs, and corporates. Let's not forget the corporates. Number 6, case studies of reformist countries, like you yourself have mentioned, Iceland, Peru, Philippines, Rwanda, Tunisia, US, they're there, but they need to be projected beyond their regional boundaries to create, again, that force multiplier effect. So that we can learn from each other and we don't reinvent the wheel as such. Number 7, this should be the basis for creating what I call model legislation, which then encompasses all aspects of social norms and barriers combined with relevant CSR projects. Now, the CSR projects, ESG, these days it's ESG, but they need to be more purpose-driven and sustainable CSR projects. Which can then ensure legislative action on ground and which can then translate into sustainable efforts which can create evidence-based knowledge economies. Number 8, assisting IMF members, you mentioned, Ratna, the surveillance financial assistance capacity is all very well. However, I feel that there needs to be ownership which needs to be taken by governments versus the IMF blame games for political point scoring. And we've seen that in our countries, in the developing part of the world. So a bit more ownership is required on that front. And now I have some 5 additional recommendations, not based on your 2 reports, but based on a larger, the macro picture as such. Liam, I'd like specifically, to concentrate on this. That there has to be there is too much duplication going on, and a lot of time and effort is being wasted. So there needs to be a deduplication effort required between all IFIs. So it's good that there is this network between for World Bank and IMF for the Parliamentary Network. There's others as well, but on similar legislative issues a lot of duplication is happening, which is losing us dollars, because money is time as such. And that can be done through informal networks versus just the UN networks, because the UN networks get very, how can I say it, bureaucratic and long-winded. Informal channels are normally also, I wouldn't call it track true, but it's certainly they work faster. And that's something I want to discuss with you later. Number two, they need to be periodic, these interactions. They need to be low cost. Zoom events are great, where data is shared of success stories across institutions with all stakeholders. Number three, an alliance of model legislation minus the CSR only resolves half the equation, leaving the implementation and evidence-based monitoring on one side. So I feel that the two of them need to be combined to give you the final punch, as I can say that. Number four, parliamentary tools need to be evaluated and reformed, since they are the biggest impediments. I've been in parliament twice, once in opposition and once in government. And I can say that a lot of times we are, I had the good fortune of legislating two major laws. One was the one that set up the Pakistan Institute for Parliamentary Services, which is the research organization, which every democratic country kind of takes for granted, but we did not have. The asset-based legislation. And I'm just going to now, I'd like to screen, and then
sorry, Marvi, just because we've got we've only got 15 minutes. Time? We've got 15 minutes left, and I've got lots of people who want to come in on questions. So could we just possibly wrap that up there, please? Yep, please.
I'll just take one more minute, if I may.
Yep, please.
I have a screenshot which shows you the legislation, which can be shared with everyone. I don't need to read through it, but it's just a legislation of the last 20 years on women empowerment issues. So if you want, I can quickly do that.
Yeah, please.
Okay. Okay, here is Pakistan's, can you see it? Pakistan's chronology of gender legislation.
Yeah.
Is it on the screen? So I'm not going to read through it, but just, yeah, these are some of them. I don't think I've got them all, but I did a bit of research. And that is what we have in terms of women.
We're slightly losing your signal now, Marvi, unfortunately.
Legislation to date. There's some. Okay, well, that's it. I'm done in any case.
Great. Look, that was a brilliant presentation, Marvi. Thank you so much. And yes, we've got to make sure that we get these things written up, because what's been brilliant about this session so far is how detailed and how practical many of the ideas are. Let me just, I know Hannah's got a sharp exit at 10. Let me bring in a couple of questions before I come back to Hannah and Ratna. So if I may, I'm going to shift 10 time zones backwards from Pakistan to Argentina. And Jamina, can I bring you in first and then go to Monica? Hello, have we got Jamina? No, can we go to Monica then, please? Okay, I think we maybe are missing both Jamina and Monica. So let me just pick up a couple of questions that have come through on the chat then. I think the first question that we got in from our colleagues in Nepal is just about what more we can do to strengthen, enhance women's representation in parliaments. We're still a long way off that in most parliaments. I think there's then a second question really about whether the IFIs have got good analysis of how much gender inequality is costing us. I know that there are some countries, I know my own country has made that calculation. It is a gigantic figure, but I wonder in terms of lost GDP growth, there is a view on how much gender inequality is costing us. And then maybe the third question we will finish on is just from the IFI's point of view, given some of the pressures that we now see from climate change, some of the huge new pressures that we see on the cost of living, some of the big new pressures that we see around debt sustainability, is there a priority group of policies that either the bank and the fund are urging parliamentarians to zero in on? Plus, of course, any observations that you've got, any reflections you've got on the brilliant presentations that we've heard from our parliamentarians. Hannah, perhaps I could come to you first and then come to Ratnam.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, for this excellent question. So first, on the economic cost of gender equality, in fact, the World Bank has recently completed a research which is available, and we can share the link online, assessing how much GDP would be gained in every country if the country closed the gap in employment. So just focusing on employment. And on average, the figure is 20% of GDP. So, and it's a rigorous analysis. So that's something we can share for reference, and we have the estimate for every country. And of course, female labor force participation is a big part of it, but it's not the only part. It also, the constraints relate to disaggregation, occupational disaggregation, the fact that women are often employed in lower paying jobs and face constraints, sometimes legal constraints, but sometimes social norms constraints from moving into male-dominated sectors and higher-paying professions. And in fact, our recent research also looking at success stories in countries, how women entrepreneurs have successfully moved to male-dominated trades, allows to draw lessons, what kind of policies, starting from the engagement of teachers to encourage girls to go into STEM fields, information to parents and information to young women about the earnings in the professions that are traditionally male-dominated. There are some interventions that have been proven very effective. So that's in terms of the assessment of the cost, or I would say the opportunity that we have for advancing economic development and growth through closing gender gap in employment. With respect to the question in the chat from Nepal, I would highlight, based on the bank's impact evaluations in terms of what works. Obviously, having evidence works, showing how much can be gained, and not only by women, but by households, by the communities, by the society helps. Then importantly, assessing well the institutional bottlenecks that women face and the kind of rules that can help overcome these. But finally, and I think that's relevant to the specific situation described in the QA, is also considering engaging male champions, so that there is an effort to influence behaviors, influence social norms, and that has been proven quite effective when it comes to in communities, engaging traditional leaders, engaging religious leaders, for example, in explaining the benefits of girls' empowerment or women's work outside the household. And of course, if there are at national level champions who could be engaged, that clearly can help in terms of shifting social norms. Now, finally, to the question of priority policies. So in the context of COVID and now post-COVID, one key priority is addressing gender-based violence. I think this is true across countries based on the data the World Bank collects, and I'm sure in countries that you see from various sources, there always has been a problem of gender-based violence. Even before the pandemic, we know from global data that 1 in 3 women has been a survivor of gender-based violence. But now there has been a spike of gender-based violence. So having the legislation for prevention and having the services for prevention and response to gender-based violence, having the national policy frameworks is clearly one key priority. Second priority, economic inclusion. Economic inclusion to help women re-establish their livelihoods, return to jobs, or get new economic opportunities. And that relates then to financial inclusions, having equal access to financing. And these days, of course, digital services, having equal access to mobile phones and internet and digital services that are critically important for economic opportunities. So let me stop here.
Yeah,
and thank you so much for this question.
Thank you very much for being so concise with that. Jimena Lopez, I see you back on my screen now. Jimena, do you want to come in at this stage before we go back to Ratna? No? Okay, Ratna, let me hand over to you.
Thank you very much. Let me start with the last question, which you had asked about the prioritization. You're absolutely right. There are lots of priorities. We have our core macro finance. The IMF has 4 new priorities. One is climate, digital money, fragile states, and gender and inclusion. So the beauty of our strategy that we are proposing is gender to be embedded in whatever the priorities are. If you're looking at climate, look at the gender dimension. If you're looking at digital, look at the gender dimension. That is our ultimate goal. So in a sense, what we are trying to, the message we want to send to the membership and to our teams is use a gender lens, whatever you do. Now we have a long way to go. So on the second question that also came up from Marvin and yourself, which is, can we have models that can actually tell us what the costs are and what can we do about it? So one of the 3 gaps that we identified in our strategy was analytical gaps. We want to be able to be very precise in calculating what the costs are and then coming up with policies to see how they impact the narrowing of gender gaps. Then, if I may, one question that Ramesh asked from Nepal was on done about the nasty comments that women get in parliaments because they come probably because of quotas. And one of the things we have found, and the studies have shown, that the first thing to do is to start with to sensitize everybody through conscious and unconscious training, which should be repeated and it should be mandatory too. And finally, I just want to address a couple of issues that was raised Nana and also Marvi on the question of the interest rates which are perverse, as you call it, because the small people are seen as those with greater risk. What I can tell you is your current governor, Reza Bakir, who is a very close friend of mine and also a co-author, he used to be the IMF, very sensitive and responsive to gender issues. And I'm actually working with him on some aspects of financial inclusion. So absolutely reach out to him and he can think about different ways in which this issue can be addressed. But one thing I do want to say is that what we are finding in India, for example, I'm Indian, is fintech companies, they don't have huge costs, and in China too, the costs of borrowing are much lower from fintech companies, even though they give small amounts, and that's okay because a lot of people need very small amounts of loans. And finally, on this question of ownership, Marvi, I cannot, disagree with you. 100% agree. It's so important to have ownership because what we have found in our years of experience is that's the only way it's going to work. And on your point about duplication and informal channels, I am standing very firm right now in collaborating with the IFIs only through informal channels. I don't want to formalize anything right now. I want to see what works, and it's working beautifully. And Hannah is a great example. We are working well together. Thank you.
That's brilliant. Thank you. Right, we're just approaching the end of our time together now. So just one final question from the floor, which is a simple one, really. For parliamentarians, Hannah, let me start with you. For parliamentarians, what is the best way now going forward to draw down on your institution's knowledge capital, your data, and resources? What's the sort of final message to the way you would like to see parliamentarians working with you on our shared goals?
That's an excellent question. As you know, traditionally the World Bank Group works through ministries of finance and other sector, but there have been examples when members of Parliament have invited World Bank Group experts to come and share evidence, share examples, respond to specific questions, how countries have dealt with specific reforms. So I think this is a good example where the World Bank can informally bring evidence, bring relevant knowledge and examples that would be of help. But of course, the World Bank also has a vast knowledge management system. So there is a lot, in fact, all our research, all the data I mentioned, the gender portal data, all of it is available online. And finally, almost in every client country, the World Bank Group has its office. And the easiest way to engage and have support and contribution from the World Bank is to contact the local office, and we will be delighted. It's a treasured opportunity for the World Bank to actually have to speak with and have the opportunity to bring evidence, knowledge, and influence a little bit the reforms in countries.
Fantastic, brilliant, thank you. And Ratna, what's your answer to that?
Oh, just one key message at this point. Since we are just starting out on our strategy, really the biggest thing that the parliamentarians can do is to support the work that the staff are doing, and they can do this by reaching out to their representatives who are at the IMF board to say that this is an important topic. We are still in the process of convincing our board that this is important and that we should go ahead and do this work in reducing gender disparities because they have macroeconomic and financial significance. So the very basic, if they could just reach out. Yeah, thank you.
Good message. I'll underline that in Washington when I'm there next week. Now, miraculously, I've managed to bring us in almost on time, which is unprecedented, I think, for one of these sessions. Thank you so much to all of our speakers. For what, as ever, you find yourself at the end of these meetings just thinking, we're just getting going. This is just the beginning of something that's got to get much bigger, much faster. So there's three things that I'd like everybody to do after this meeting. The first is write. So one of the big investments we made as a parliamentary network over the last year and a half is to build our digital platform. That is a really important knowledge exchange mechanism for parliamentarians to parliamentarians, from parliamentarians to IFIs, and from IFIs to parliamentarians. It's three-way traffic. I'd love to encourage you to write just short blog posts up to 800, 900 words that we can post on our platform. Second, think about creating what you might call a track P in your countries, attract parliamentarians, by setting up chapters of the Parliamentary Network in your countries or in your regions. If you'd like more information on that, please just drop an email to us at the email address that you received this information from. We are encouraging countries, colleagues around the world to create chapters of the Parliamentary Network in your countries and in your regions. And these then become your platforms on which you can begin working much more efficiently with local representatives from the bank and the fund, and indeed from the global representatives of the bank and the fund. And then the final thing I'd love you to do is join us for the spring meetings. So we've got a brilliant program shaping up, thanks to Gergana and Philippe and Blythe and Elizabeth and Cafu and everybody who supports the Parliamentary Network. We've got some brilliant workshops coming up at the spring meetings. We'll be circulating details of that quite soon. And at the spring meetings, we'll be setting out the Parliamentary Network work programme for the next couple of years. We've thought long and hard about the priorities that we've got, how we build a world of green, inclusive and shock-proof growth. We've listened hard to what the fund has said to us, what the bank has said to us. So a really good programme of events is something that we will be launching at the spring meeting. So please do join us for that. That's it for now. Thank you so much to everybody for joining us. That has been an absolutely brilliant, practical, impassioned discussion about progress. So for something like that at the middle of the week, that is a good sign. So to wherever you're tuning in from, I hope you have a great rest of day, and please stay in touch. Bye for now.
Thank you, Liam. See you again soon. Bye-bye. Thank you.